for someone, translation can be done, but they just don't want to do translation for no one is going to use headphones. So it's actually not a problem, but if people want to have any translation, can you raise your hand? Okay, so we want the Korean translation we want, yes?
English.
Yes, but from which language?
From English language.
From Korean, yeah?
It's called interpretation. Maybe he wants to know the
Interpretation. Interpretation. Oh, you're Japanese. Okay. We can't. You're Japanese. I'm afraid we can't. We don't have Japanese on offer, though probably we should. So okay. So it doesn't look like we have people calling for interpretation. So so if someone could let the interpreters know that. Well, actually, I guess they can hear you. You can hear. You've been listening. Thank you. Right. So that's dealt with that little issue. Now, I want to just say a few words of introduction, because the last IUCN Congress in Barcelona 4 years ago, this Congress was notable for the announcing of 2 new funding mechanisms. On the first day of the Congress, Razan Khalifa Al Mubarak, who is now the Secretary General of the Environment Agency Abu Dhabi, announced the formation of the Mohammed bin Zayed Species Conservation Fund. And I can't remember whether it was a day or 2 later, Gustavo, but Monique Barbu announced the plans to establish the Save Our Species Fund as a partnership of Jeff and the World Bank, and was exploring the possibility of IUCN involvement at that stage and various other partners. And so this was pretty fantastic news for all of us who are interested in the funding of species conservation and know how starved this sector of funding has been in recent years. If you want a demonstration on how starved they have been, you only have to look at the number of applications that these 2 funds received in relation to what they would like to be able to pay out. And also, although it's fantastic that we have these 2 new funds, and a lot of good work is already being done because of them, both funds fully recognize that the market is very, very, very far from saturated. So anyway, that's the starting context. We made a huge step forwards from 4 years ago, and so really the point of this meeting is to discuss about how we will take the next big step forwards. We're going to have 2 presentations, I think, to provoke us or to give us different perspectives, and then we are going to have a panel discussion. And the first presentation will be given by Gustavo Fonseca from the Global Environment Facility, and who has been one of the prime movers of the Save Our Species Fund. The second will be given by Adam Sweden from the Synchronicity Earth, a UK-based foundation. You call it, will you, Adam? Charity. After Adam has spoken, then I think we're going to have a panel discussion, which will be facilitated by Valerie Hickey from the World Bank, who's very graciously stepped in to do it on behalf, instead of me, because I have been summoned to the West Asia members meeting where I've got to go and account for myself in about half an hour. So I'll go to that and then I'll come back for a bit. But obviously, once the discussion starts, I think Valerie has to continue it, because I won't know anything about the previous discussion, if you're okay with that, Valerie. Thanks. And the panel will be our 2 speakers, Gustavo and Adam.
Do you have Spanish translation?
Translators at the back, interpreters at the back. We have had a request for Spanish interpretation. Okay? They're going to do it, yeah. Okay. The answer is it's coming. Yeah. Thank you very much for your flexibility at the back there. So the panel is Gustavo, Adam, Frederick Launay from the, well, I guess in this context it's Mohammed bin Zayed Species Conservation Fund you're representing. We have, who else is on the panel? You are you? What are you doing on the panel? Jonathan Bailey from the Zoological Society of London. Jolyn Friedman from the Endangered Wildlife Trust, South Africa. And Jean-Christophe Villiers, Deputy Head of the Species Programme of IUCN, and also, along with Gustavo, Valerie and others, one of the instigators of the SOS Fund. So I think, Gustavo, you're on first, going to give a short talk, followed by Adam. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Jean-Christophe, for inviting me for this presentation. I was asked to talk a little bit about the challenges and opportunity for financing species conservation. And I've organized this talk first speaking about my institution, which is the Global Environment Facility, that by virtue of being the financial mechanism of the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and since 1992 has been serving with that function. We have, of course, provided significant resources to that benefited species on a global scale. Actually, the notion of species financing, it's kind of a difficult one to pin down, because if you look at the portfolio and to classify a project as one that is benefiting species either directly or indirectly, it's not easy, and I'll try to show you why. This is some of the investments of the GEF since it was created at the eve of the Earth Summit in 1992 in Rio. And we serve other conventions as well, but the CBD is about 30% of our resources. We have so far invested $3.1 billion in funding for biodiversity with global benefits. And this has leveraged some $9 billion from governments, from agencies such as the World Bank and the multilateral development banks, UN agencies, some from the private sector, and from other sources. This investment has resulted in the creation and improved management of close to 3,000 protected areas, which span about 700 million hectares. And of course, this also help to achieve the 10% target of the world terrestrial area under protection. We also did a lot of work on mainstreaming, as we call it there, which is basically working in the larger landscape, the seascapes and the production landscape and seascape, trying to make them more biodiversity friendly. And we estimate that this investment has spanned some 274 million hectares. And we also began a number of pioneer schemes financing, in particular payment for ecosystem services and conservation trust funds now in about 40 countries that are trying to provide steady financing flows to biodiversity, and of course including species. The GEF follows guidance from the CBD by virtue of being a financial instrument. So every COP there is a series of negotiations that tell us what we need to do at the high level, the programmatic level, but then we have to transform that guidance into an operational strategy. And these are the things that we invest on, these 5 bullet points here. The first one is protected areas, improve the sustainability of protected areas, and this takes about 60%, or has taken 60% of our resources historically. The second one, again, is working outside of protected areas, at the larger landscape, at the production landscape and seascapes, and this I would say takes another 30% of our resources. And the last 3 are responsible for about 10% of our resources and 90% of our headaches, because they're highly complicated, very difficult issues politically. But nonetheless, they are very important for the convention, such as the biosafety arena and the Cartagena Protocol. More recently now, with the approval of the Nagoya Protocol on access and benefit sharing arising from the utilization of generic resources, we're starting to work a lot there. And we also fund countries to fulfill the obligations of the conventions, particularly now transforming their national biodiversity plans into operational strategies to implement the Aichi targets that were agreed in Nagoya. So most of the money that goes eventually into species conservation comes from this first objective, which is working through protected areas, which seems to be a decent assumption that we have to make, because according to estimates, some 70 to 80% of all threatened species are threatened because of habitat loss, and Simon may correct me if I'm misquoting, but it's about that, the rest of course being invasive species and other threats. And I would like to, in GEF 5 we got, for the new strategy, 2 additional guidances from the convention that ended up being transformed into 2 other outcomes under this strategic objective. The first one is dealing with climate change, but more important for us here is finally the conservation, dealing with conservation of threatened species. Amazingly enough, this was not in the convention guidance to the GEF. Of course, we did a lot of that, but it was basically about the larger landscape of protected areas, but not necessarily looking at threatened species in any comprehensive way. So we managed to use this opportunity to establish additional programs, SOS being one of them. I'll get there later on in the presentation. And I try to classify JEF money that went for species conservation. Again, this is a kind of difficult one to classify because sometimes the project is not necessarily looking at populations of threatened species, but is protecting areas that are habitat for these species. And so you might want to classify that as investment species, even though it's not directly managing threatened species and the drivers of threat to that particular species. But anyways, these are the ones that we can surely classify out of the portfolio as being investments in threatened species. So it's about $250 million that were given in grants from the JEF Trust Fund that have mobilized some $400 million in additional funding in co-financing. So it's significant funding, and I would dare to say that's probably the largest investment in species globally from any single financial mechanism. We have had the distribution in terms of geography, in terms of regions. Asia got most of the money with about 26%, and then we have Latin America, Africa. But please note that in this pie chart here, you have close to 40% of all money going for regional and global projects dealing with threatened species. And a lot of that has actually benefited migratory species, so we did a lot of that, and of course that has to do with global and regional efforts. And more we are unable to do those regional and global projects because with the evolution of the instrument, most of the money now is locked into country envelopes, and some of you who may know about the GF, each country has an allocation that belongs to the country, and the countries are sovereign to program those resources. They may choose to utilize for species conservation, or they may choose to utilize, for example, for mainstreaming investments in the production landscape. So we are less and less able, at this stage, at least, may change in the next replenishment cycle, of dealing with global and regional projects. In terms of agencies, and again, JEF is only a financial mechanism. It doesn't implement any projects. It doesn't execute any projects. It just provides financing. And we work through UN agencies and the multilateral development banks. As you can see here, UNDP, that provides primarily technical assistance in protected areas. They're very active, is the first agency here in terms of volume, followed by the World Bank, which has had historically a good contribution, and then other agencies with relatively small pieces of this. If you look at this evolution from the pilot phase of the JEF that began in 1992, and in terms of number of projects and volume of resources, most of the investments that we had up to the third cycle of the JEF, which ended in 2006, it was primarily to protected areas, which is interesting. And now you see in JEF 4, which ended in 2010, just the reverse in terms of investments. Most of the investments that benefited species came through mainstreaming investments, meaning outside of protected areas rather than inside protected areas. And this may have may explain some of the results that we see today. In JEF 5, we still have the data because we had just mid-term, the mid-phase of the distribution of funding resources. We try to look at the distribution of resources of where this investment went, and the protected areas that JEF has put money span the distribution of 647 globally threatened species according to the red list. This is the distribution. And these projects addressing protected areas with threatened species are responsible for 17% of all the volume of resources that we've given out in the biodiversity focal area, and 25% of all investments that went into protected areas. So it's quite significant. Not all investments in protected areas have actually benefited globally threatened species, but quite a significant proportion has gone into threatened species. There hasn't been any let's say, logic into this. I mean, there's no focus on priorities for certain tax, etc. This is, of course, this is not a comprehensive list, but you can see that it's all over the place in terms of all over the map and all over the the taxonomy in terms of who benefited from these investments. Then gets to my second part of my presentation, which was asked to, from our perspective, why are we interested in protecting species? And when I came to the GEF in 2007, I was told that we didn't do species. So well, we don't do that anymore because that's not really an efficient way of investing limited resources. We might as well go out and try to do larger projects that benefit other ecosystems at multiple levels. But of course, species have been the entry point for conservation of biodiversity. In most countries, at least in the modern era, I'm showing some examples of the United States that has shown that investments that are focused on threatened species actually result in good outcomes. So you can actually accomplish what you set out to do. And most developing countries that we work with actually emulated this trend, and they began doing conservation of biodiversity by looking at threatened species. Species, of course, are also good indicators of environmental quality, and efforts connected towards protection generally trickle down to benefit the ecosystem as a whole. And of course, we need to look into things that we yet don't know the consequence, and so the proportionality principle needs to being called for. However, we are faced constantly with a set of assumptions why we should not perhaps invest in species conservation as opposed to looking at the ecosystem and have that level interventions as being more cost effective. So it predominates the coarse filter approach as opposed to trying to look also at the fine filter approach and trying to address those species that fall out of interventions at the large ecosystems. With the predominance now of focus on ecosystem services, livelihood, benefits, human well-being, and so forth, and you heard this a lot in this meeting here, there's an assumption that threatened species contribute very little to that, and so the consequences of losing them are not necessarily felt by those who depend on the provision of ecosystem services. There's also arguments, I'm calling triage school, that many species are now beyond recovery, at least beyond recovery, without significant investments, and in the absence of high investments. And these resources are also very limited, could be used for other priorities. There's the argument also that species that are functionally extinct, meaning that they don't provide anymore the functions that they provided before in the ecosystem, also become lesser priorities. And I'm starting to see, I'm calling here the Pollyannas, who there are some people that or there are some actually papers coming out that suggest that most threatened species are actually quite resilient than you previously assumed, and actually can do very well in human-dominated landscapes, whether you agree with that or you don't. But we do agree at the GEF there are opportunities and incentives that we still need to pursue in funding species conservation. Number one, as I said before, it's a tangible endeavor. We know, society knows why you do that. The results are attainable, they are cost effective, the public relates to that. Every time that we have a story about the species, we have the media looking for us. Every time that we have a story that we put out on ecosystem services and this and that, we don't have a lot of attention. Species conservation can also deliver additional results. Of course, it doesn't, species doesn't get conserved in the absence of in a vacuum, in the absence of the context in which it's being conserved. And again, it's cost effective. So we need to revitalize the species conservation, and we're trying to do that with some targeted strategies. We, for example, have funded an NGO, RARE, in the Andes, to do conservation with AZD sites, the Alliance for Zero Extinction sites. And the link there, of course, is community engagement. It's using the plight of threatened species that are unique to these places as a conduit of the message that they're putting out. But they also are working together with, for example, provision of water services and demonstrated to local communities that the protection of species actually results in additional benefits. I mentioned before that we're also building on the COP decision that asked the GEF We invest in expansion of ecosystems and also threatened species representation in the work that we do in protected areas. And now building on implementation of the Aichi targets that do have direct connections with threatened species. And we need to disseminate the successful experiences that we have. One of these initiatives, as Simon mentioned at the beginning of his presentation, we started to explore a different way of getting the message across and mobilizing the sector that hasn't been really tapped into, which is the private sector in species conservation. And we developed together with the World Bank and IUCN this assumption through this model that if we provided the necessary incentive, including our money into this, there would be interest from the private sector, because after all, companies do like animal species, and they have been branding their businesses with species everywhere. And the research that was done for this was quite extensive, and literally thousands and thousands of companies that you can trace and products that are linked to species. Species add value to many brands, meaning the plight of a particular species may affect the value of a brand. So the assumption again would be that that companies